So astrology and astronomy in Judaism. We're going to focus more on the astrology part today, and then maybe the astronomy part in the future. And first, we need to differentiate between astrology and astronomy. So astronomy is, of course, the study of space and the different things, entities in space, various celestial bodies and how they move and their nature and so on, so on. And that's astronomy is more of the science part of it, more of the physical part of it. And then astrology is more of the, perhaps the spiritual part of it. So still concerned with the stars and their motions and things like that, but more of perhaps, do they influence what goes on here on Earth? Do they influence our lives? How does it connect to various spiritual worlds in our own lives? So there's astrology and astronomy. And the Torah says like this, so we should really, it's talking about the Torah, that we should fulfill the Torah and keep it and study it and so on. Why? Because this is our wisdom. This is your knowledge, your wisdom. Before the eyes of all the nations, who they will hear about these laws. And they will say, and the nations will look at us and look at the Jewish people and say, wow, this is a very wise people, because they will see the wisdom in the Torah. So that's the simple meaning of that verse. But then our sages use this verse to say something a little bit different, because they say, okay, so the nations will appreciate our Torah learning, but the Torah learning is not really relevant to them. Because all these different halachic discussions, Talmudic discussions, all of our interpretations of the Torah and so on, that's not really relevant to the nations of the world. So what is the wisdom that the nations will appreciate and be amazed at? So the sages say it's really talking about astronomy. Okay, so the Rambam lists this in his Sefer HaMitzvot. He says, Manu chashuv tkufot, that astronomical calculations, so tkufot, meaning being able to calculate different time periods and heavenly cycles, astronomical cycles, Manu, they listed this as a mitzvah, to be able to calculate the stars and astronomical cycles. And where does it come from? So the Rambam says, because from this verse, okay, and the Gemara says, which is the wisdom that the nations will appreciate and be amazed at. So this must be referring to the calculation, various astronomical calculations, and tkufot and mazalot. So both astronomy and mazalot means the constellations. And mazal is a constellation. So that's what really they will appreciate, right? The scientific things. So the nations are not so concerned about what's in our own Torah that's relevant to us, but whatever is derived from the Torah and has to do with science, with nature, with space, that's something that the whole world can appreciate. Right? And it has been like that, right? We know that throughout history, the Jewish people have been very strongly involved in the sciences and have been behind some of the biggest scientific discoveries and breakthroughs. And that's something that the nations do appreciate. And Jews have won something like 1/4 of Nobel Prizes, because that's something that everybody, the whole world, can appreciate and learn from, the astronomy part. So it's actually a mitzvah to learn astronomy, tkufot and mazalot. And then there's this astrology part of it. One thing is to actually understand the heavenly bodies and space, and that's also relevant to halacha in terms of calculating like the Jewish calendar and when the holidays would fall and so on. But also there's another step there, is, do the movements of the stars and planets and constellations, does that somehow affect our lives? Does it influence our lives? So that's already the mazalot part. And what does it mean? What does mazalot mean? We say mazal tov, right? We also say b'sha tova to people. So mazalot are constellations. And when you tell somebody the word mazal, the root of it is the same as nozel, which is flowing, which is fluid, liquid. Right? So mazal literally means flow. So we're talking about these constellations, stars, it's as if there's some kind of flow from the heavens down to earth that can influence the events of this planet. So when you wish somebody a mazal tov, you're wishing them like literally a good flow, okay? Or it's almost like a good constellation, but like a good flow from the heavens. And an alternative, we say B'Shah Tova. And they actually both come from the same source, which is from the Talmud, from Masachet Shabbat, page 156a, which is over there. We're going to talk about, we're going to see some of the astrological wisdom in that page of Talmud. A lot of what we're going to say later on comes from there. And so that page discusses how the mazalot can influence our lives, how they affect people. And there it says, there's one opinion that says, Lo mazal yom gorem, ela mazal sha'a gorem. So there's one opinion that the particular mazal of the month is relevant, of course. We talk about, when we talk about constellations and astrology, we talk about the zodiac, 12 signs. So that's like the month, but there's also mazal for each week and for each day. And even for each hour, there are various heavenly effects that occur, changes that occur in space, even every hour. So there's one opinion that says what's most important in affecting a person's life or their nature quality is the time, the actual hour, sha'a. So it's not just the mazal yom, it's not just the constellation or the flow of the day or the month or the week, but specifically the sha'a. So we say B'Shah Tova, you're wishing somebody that should come in the right hour specifically. So that's actually where it comes from. Both Mazal Tov and Shah Tova, you're wishing kind of good flow. So a good, may all the heavenly bodies align just in the right way to make this go well for you. That's the idea of both Mazal Tov and Shah Tova, which originates from really, or at least according to one explanation from this page of the Talmud. So now, how do we know that astrology is really a thing? Like, where do we see from the Torah? Again, we derive everything from the Torah. So where do we see from the Torah, from the Tanakh, from Scripture? Where do we see that the stars actually have some kind of effect? And there are many verses. So I just picked a few, just off the top of my head. There are many verses. So one is in Tehillim, which says, "Hashemayim mesaprim kvod el u'maaseh yadav magid erkiya," that the heavens relate God's glory. U'maaseh yadav, and the magid erkiya, the rakiya, the firmament, which is where all the stars are suspended. I mean, firmament is not a good translation, but the rakiya is space. It's where all the stars and planets are. So the rakiya is telling us about maaseh yadav, God's work, God's handiwork. So there's two ways to read this verse. Like, one way to understand it is just when we look at the stars and planets and astronomy and see how perfect everything is in space, that really shows us the wisdom of God, the glory of God, because everything in space is so fine-tuned. You know, we talked about this before, that we live in such a fine-tuned universe. Everything is so precise. All these motions of planets, everything is going, the moon's going around the earth and the earth's going around the sun, and everything is just spinning just right. And it just goes down to precise numbers and all the constants involved and the gravity and the forces. It's really unbelievable. And we gave the example also of just something as simple as the moon and sun appear to us as being the same size in the sky, even though the sun is, of course, tremendously larger than the moon, but they appear to us to be the same size because the sun's diameter is 400 times larger than the moon's. And it just so happens to be that the sun is also 400 times further away from the moon. And so in the night sky, the sun and moon look to be the same size. And that's why you can have a total eclipse, a total solar eclipse, where the moon can perfectly block out the sun. And that's really incredible precision. To say that this emerged just coincidentally, right? That just the solar system just arose because of natural processes, random processes, is very unlikely, right? It seems like when you study space, everything is so perfect and precise and fine-tuned. So that shows us, when we study astronomy, it shows us kind of God's glory. But that's one way of reading this verse. Another way of reading this verse is that more literally, that the movements of the heavens and the stars can actually tell us what is happening in the world, right? Maaseh Adav, the things that are happening that God is planning for the world, can be determined through the motions of the stars. And we read in Bamidbar, we read in last week's parsha, that in Bilam's prophecy, where he says, he's talking about the end of days, which is saying it's very far away in the future. I see it, but it's not now, it's in the distant future. It's a very famous prophecy that a star emerges, it's talking about the time of Mashiach. And we're going to talk more about that at the end. But something to do with the stars, a prophecy of a change in the sky and the stars with the coming of Mashiach. We read in Shoftim, after Dvorah and Barak fought off Sisera. You remember that episode in the Tanakh? And then they sang a song, right? Deborah's song. And one of the psukim there, she sang, Min shamayim nilchamu hakochavim. So it's like from the heavens, the stars fought with us. Mim silotam nilchamu im Sisra. That as if the stars helped us win this war. So Deborah is like being grateful for the stars, to the stars for helping to defeat Sisra. So again, there's a connection there. Somehow the astrological influence, the stars lined up just right to help the Israelites defeat the wicked army of Sisra. So that's another. And another place is from Bereshit. So God took Abraham outside. God told Abraham, go look up at the sky and and count the stars if you can. So God told Abraham that your offspring will be like the stars. So again, there's a couple of ways to understand this verse. The simple meaning is that God just told him that Abraham's offspring would be very numerous, and Abraham would be the father of many nations. That's what his name means, right? Abraham's supposed to mean, like our sages say, Av Hamon Goim, that he is the father of many nations. And today we do see that in the world, that most of the world's population claims to be in some way connected to Abraham, whether directly, like biologically, or spiritually, or Christians, Muslims, Jews, so many of the people that are under the umbrella of Abraham's descendants. So that is true. That's a simple meaning of this verse, that Abraham's offspring would be as numerous as the stars. But another way to read this verse is, it's literally saying, God is saying, look at the stars, and what you see is that your offspring will follow the stars. They will be like the stars. And then on this, the Talmud, again, that same page, Shabbat 156, says something interesting. What did he say? Amar Avram lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Abraham told God and said, Ribbono shel olam, Master of the universe, ben beiti yoresh oti. Right? So he said that I don't have children, right? At that time, Abraham didn't have any children. So he says, my servant is going to inherit everything that I have, right? Ben beiti, he's going to inherit. And God told him, love, no. Why? Because the Torah says, like you will have your own children that will come from you, from your own loins. And Amar lefanav, Abraham told God, Ribono shel olam, nistakalti be'itztagninut. So Abraham says, I looked in my itztagninut, which Rashi comments and says, itztagninut means chokhmat mazalot, means astrology, the constellations. So Abraham was an astrologer in some ways himself originally, and he had looked in his stars essentially, and and he learned that he is not destined to have children. So he did a little bit of fortune telling from his own constellations, from his own astrological signs and things like that. And he said that I'm not supposed to have a child. And this is when God stepped in and said, Amar lo get rid of your astrology, come out of it. She'ein mazal leIsrael. That's very important words that God told Abraham, ein mazal leIsrael, right? Israel doesn't have a mazal. Doesn't mean that Israel's unlucky. It means that there's no constellation that guides Israel. We are outside. God told them, come out of it, step out of it, because we have the power to break free from the constellations. Yes, there are constellations. Yes, they do have a flow. They have some kind of mazal, some kind of flow into this world, but we have the power to break free from it. Why? Because we have God on our side, right? If you're connected to God, then what need do you have for why do you need to worry about astrological phenomena, right? You have faith in God, and whatever God decrees, that's what's supposed to happen. You should know that you can pray to God, and you can change your destiny. You can change. You have the power to take control of your own life. And our sages say that the meaning here is she'ein mazal leIsrael, that we don't have a constellation because God is our constellation. Everything comes from God. That's it. We just need to have faith in God, and you don't need to look at all these stars and things like that. And one place that discusses this, the Ramban discusses this in his discourse on Rosh Hashanah, and he uses the pasuk. It's not just there; it's just one of the sources from Parashat Hazinu, which says, that at the beginning God separated the world. He put various peoples in various countries and different nations. And the deeper meaning there is that he appointed also various spiritual forces and constellations to oversee these other nations. But for Israel, for Yaakov, ki chelek Adonai amo, Yaakov chevel nachalato. So that Yaakov, Israel, is actually directly under God's supervision. So while God separated various nations and put various angels and other forces and heavenly entities to supervise them, when it comes to Israel, God didn't put anything over Israel. God himself oversees Israel. So that's what it means, Ein Mazal Israel, that we don't have a constellation. We are directly under God's watch. And therefore, it's actually forbidden, halachically, to use astrology for fortune telling. Just like Abraham failed in that, because he tried to tell his own fortune through the stars, and God told him, no, come out of that. So you're not allowed to use astrology for fortune telling, or to consult a fortune teller, or even to believe in auspicious times or not inauspicious times. So the Rambam writes this as halacha in the Mishnah Torah, because Ezo Me'onen, there's a mitzvah in the Torah not to be involved in anything that has to do with this idea of being a Me'onen. And he says, Elun notnei itim shamrim be'itztagninut, there's that word again, right? People who look at their astrology and say, Yom ploni tov, Yom ploni ra, that this is a good day and this is a bad day, right? Yom ploni ra'ui la'asot b'melacha, this is a good day to do some certain work, some action, or that year's good, or that whatever it is. Some days are good, some days are bad. And it's forbidden to do that. And we cannot believe that this is a good time, this is a lucky time, this is an unlucky time. Like even just to predict the future, you shouldn't do, even if you're not actually acting upon it, because none of this stuff matters for us, for the Jewish people. We don't need to worry about mazalot. So that actually connects to the time period that we're in now. We're in the 3 weeks, where there's this common, you always hear that during the 3 weeks, it's like an unlucky time. And like conversely, in the month of Adar, it's a lucky time. And in the 3 weeks, it's an unlucky time. So there's this idea that you hear today a lot, like to avoid doing dangerous things during the 3 weeks because it's an unlucky time. And according to the Rambam, he doesn't list this as halacha at all. The Rambam rejected that. The Rambam, being a rationalist, he says, no, it's clear you're not allowed to believe that this time is lucky and this time is unlucky. There's no such thing. If you believe in God, then what difference does it make? Right? God's consistent. Ani Hashem lo shaniti. God is always watching over us, and God's supervision of us is the same. Doesn't matter if it's Tammuz or Adar. What's meant to happen will happen, and so you don't need to believe in various superstitions. That's according to the Rambam. But there are other opinions that say no. There is this mazal there, and we'll see why. There is a mazal here. There is a certain flow, and not everybody is capable of being like an Abraham, coming out of the astrology. And some people will be influenced by what is going on in the heavens. So it could be a dangerous time for the average person. So there is something there. And some people have the power to come out, to break free from that, to break free, to transcend nature. That's ultimately the purpose for all of us, to transcend our physical, biological nature, to become more angelic, to become more spiritual. So certain people who work on themselves in that way can break free from all influence, from all natural and astrological influence, but a lot of people can't. So perhaps there is some danger there. But generally speaking, you're not allowed to do any kind of astrological fortune telling or believe that this is a good time to do something, this is a bad time to do something. Just have faith in Hashem, regardless of the time of the year, and do what you need to do. Now, where you can use astrology is just to understand yourself, right? To understand the Torah, to understand the Jewish calendar, why we do certain things, certain rituals at certain times of the year, just for our own kind of personal development, without fortune telling or anything like that, to better understand ourselves and to better understand the cosmos. That is allowed. Yeah, so that's what we're going to do here. What we're going to learn here is not anything to do with fortune telling, because that's forbidden. It's all about actually just getting a better understanding of the cosmos, okay, and larger periods of time, and seeing how we kind of connect to the universe at large, because there's this idea that a human being is a olam katan, is a small universe, and the universe is an adam gadol. It's like a big person. Like we are a microcosm of the entire universe. We are intertwined with the universe, and whatever goes on with the heavens, it does have some connection to us in some way. So that's what we want to understand. How are we connected? How is our life and the Torah and the Jewish calendar and the spiritual things and angels and God, how is it all connected? So that's what we're going to try to map out over here. So there are 88 total constellations. This is a map of a lot of them, but not all of them. And of those 88, 12 of them are special because 12 of them run along the ecliptic line. Okay, so what it means is that when you look up at the sky over the course of the year, the sun will move through, as when from our vantage point, when we look up at the sky, the sun will appear to move through 12 of the constellations. So again, a constellation is a collection of a pattern of stars in the sky. It's just a pattern, but it's an accepted pattern. It's one of these amazing things that all over the world, different cultures and nations going back centuries and millennia kind of have the same patterns and look at these things in the same way. Sometimes they call them different things, but for some reason, it's something that's like basically universal, that there's this universal agreement, more or less, about these shapes, these constellations. And there is a reason for that, by the way, which we might discuss in the future. That has to do with where did this knowledge originally come from? It has to do with a figure named Hanoch. So maybe we'll talk about that later on. And so that the constellation is like a pattern, distinct pattern of stars in the night sky. And so the ecliptic line, that's like the path, basically the path of the sun, the way we see it. And so the sun will move through 12 of these constellations, actually 13, which we'll get to the 13th as well. Generally, we talk about 12 constellations that the sun moves through out of the 88. And so this was well known throughout history. This is from a book that was originally published in the 12th century by Rabbi Avraham Bar Chia. I may have mentioned him before, very important, both as a rabbi and as an astronomer and mathematician. So he wrote a book called Surat Haaretz, and this is from a republication from the 18th century, but the book was originally written in the 12th century that again shows the Earth, right? Aretz and Galgala Mazalot, so that's the ecliptic line, and you can actually make out very faintly the names of the 12 zodiac constellations here. So that's the ecliptic line, and the movements of the other planets, which we're going to talk about later on. And Rabbi Avraham Bar Chia, by the way, is the earliest known historical written piece that discusses the quadratic formula is from one of his texts. So some credit him with coming up with the quadratic, or maybe being the first to kind of discover the quadratic formula, or at least derive the quadratic formula. The earliest known historical source to do that is a rabbi, Sephardi rabbi who lived about 1,000 years ago. Now, here as well, you see that there are five, the motions of the five planets also play a role. There are five visible planets in the night sky. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So those all play roles in astrology as well. The other planets like Uranus and Neptune, they were not discovered until very recently. They're not visible to the naked eye. So before technology, human beings didn't have access to those. So in astrology, there's only the five visible planets that play a role, and because they can move through the constellations as well. So maybe you've seen, if you've ever read like a horoscope, like Mars is in this constellation right now, right? So the position of Mars right now, Mars appears in Libra. Okay, so now what does that mean? What does Mars represent? So Mars is a famous one because Mars is the red planet. It's associated with war, conflict, things like that. So Mars is in Libra. Perhaps that's a sign of some kind of impending conflict, right? That's how these horoscopes are often, that's how they come up with them. Venus is maybe associated with love, right? So Venus is in this constellation. So what does that mean? That Venus is in Leo. So the planets also are moving over the course of the year from our perspective. And so they appear in different places along the constellation, so that can have a certain meaning as well. And so the Talmud actually talks about all this, about how the planets in the various constellations affect us. So again, it's from Masechet Shabbat. And I just took some examples. You can go there if you want the full page and see all the details. So for example, somebody who's born specifically right when the sun, Chama, is right in their sign, Yehei Gvar Zivtan will be a very radiant, luminous person. And Yehei Achil Midileh V'Shatei Midileh will be like, will always have an abundance of food and drink. And somebody who was born under the sign of Kochav Noga, under Venus, when that was in their sign, Yehi Gvar Atir Vezanai, which means Atir means Ashir, rich, could become very rich, and Zanai also, but perhaps a little promiscuous, right? Again, Noga is associated, Venus associated with love and things like that, sexual things. So perhaps there's going to be a test and challenge in that department. And Manda Bekochav in Mercury, Yehi Gvar Nahir V'Chakim, that's a sign of being wise. Mercury is a sign of wisdom. And Shabtai is Saturn. Yehi Gvar Machshavateh Batlin. So this is a person whose thoughts are going to be kind of batalin, like, null and void, not good in their thoughts. But others say ve'ita amre kol de mechashvin alea batlin, that there's this person actually, it might be a good thing, because people who think negative thoughts about them, who maybe plot negatively against them, those things will not come true. As an aside, Shabtai is, the days of the week are named. This also comes from Sefer Yetzirah, which we're going to talk about later, but the 7 days of the week also correspond to the 7 visible bodies in the sky. So the sun and moon and the 5 planets. In many cultures, the days of the week are named after those 7 heavenly bodies, in English as well. Like Sunday is the sun, of course, Monday is the moon. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are named after the Norse Germanic equivalents to these 5 planets. And then Saturday is Saturn, right? So, and whether in French, it's easier to see in French, like Tuesday is Mardi, right, which is Mars, and Wednesday is Mercredi, which is Mercury, and Jeudi, Thursday is Jupiter, and Vendredi is Venus, Friday. Right? So you see it easy. It's easier in French. In English, it comes from the Norse names. So like Tuesday is named after Tug, which would be the Norse god equivalent to Mars. And Wednesday, if you ever wondered why there's a silent D in Wednesday, is because named after Odin, the Norse god Woden. So it's Odin's day. And Thursday is Thor's day, named after Thor. And Friday is named after Frigg, who's the Norse equivalent of Venus. So Venus, Frigg's day, Vendredi. And in the Torah as well, in Sefer Yetzirah, it's the same relationship. So Sunday is the sun and Monday is the moon. And in Hebrew, we name our days like Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, but then we have Shabbat, right? And Shabbat is Saturday. Saturday is Saturn. Shabbat, Shabtai, right? So that's where Shabtai, the name there, is connected to Shabbat as well. And I think here where it says Shabtai, I think there's a little prophecy there in the Talmud about Shabbatai Tzvi. So whoever's familiar with Shabbatai Tzvi will, I think, will make the connection here to why the Talmud actually, I think, secretly predicts about the false messianic movement of Shabbatai Tzvi, that Yehei Gvar Machshavateh Batlin, that it will be a null and void venture by a false messiah, about Shabbatai Tzvi, probably the most famous Shabbatai in Jewish history. And somebody who was born in Tzedek, Yehi Gvar Tzidkan, Tzedek is Jupiter, it's associated with Tzedek, the name of the planet in Hebrew is Tzedek, so this person's more likely to be righteous. And finally, Hanuman de B'Mad'im, somebody who's born under Mars, like we said. Mars is the red planet. It's associated with war, conflict. Yehi Gvar Shedama, somebody who's a blood spiller, somebody who's predisposed to spill blood. Now that could seem like a bad thing, but not necessarily. Amar Rav Ashi, what does it mean? That this person can be an umana, which means an umana is a bloodletter. In ancient times, one of the common medical treatments was to bloodletting. So such a person can be a bloodletter, or even maybe a doctor, somebody who needs to draw blood regularly and is not queasy and can work with blood. And so somebody who's born under the sign of Mars could make a really good doctor or surgeon, or somebody who can work with blood, or a tabacha, a slaughterer, or a mahula, even a mohel, right? Somebody who works with blood and is not queasy with these things. Could also be a ganava, could also be a criminal, hopefully not. And then Amar Rabbah says that Ana b'madim avai, says, I was born under the sun, the star, under the sign of Mars, and I'm not any of these things. And then his disciple and nephew Abaye said, Amar Abaye, Mar nami anish v'katil. Yeah, you're not any of these things, but you're a judge, right? And you're a judge, you're like the chief rabbi here, and you're the judge. And as a judge, you send people to punishment, right? And anish v'katil, I mean, katil also means to the death penalty. I don't think Rabbah had the authority to put anybody to death, but the idea was that he did have the authority to punish people in that sense. So maybe also somebody born under Mars could be a judge or something like that. So that's Mars. Now, at the same time, the constellations, I mean, the moon goes around the Earth 12 times a year, roughly, especially in the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar, we have lunar months. And so you can start to see parallels between the months and the astrological signs, right? Because you have 12 major zodiac signs, astrological signs through which the sun moves. And then at the same time, you also have the moon going around the Earth 12 times a year. And so you can make a rough parallel between each month and each of the signs. And you can see this. This is a floor mosaic in one of the most amazing archaeological finds in Israel, a synagogue from the 6th century in Bet Shan that actually has a very perfectly preserved floor mosaic that has, that's what it looks like this, that has the 12 constellations in Hebrew, the zodiac. And they correspond to the 12 months, especially the 12 Hebrew months, because we have lunar months. So they correspond to the months of the year. So that's what we want to do for the next little bit, is actually see how do the months correspond to the constellations. And they also, this is according to Sefer Yetzirah, they also correspond to 12 key qualities of life, 12 major aspects of life. So Raya, Shmiya, Reicha, Sicha, the list is over here. The 5, basically the senses of the body, and other things like speech, thought, action, sexual intimacy and sleep, and anger, temper, laughter, something like the major aspects of life. There are 12 of them, and they correspond to the 12 months of the year and to the 12 tribes. Right? We have 12 tribes of Israel, and so the 12 tribes correspond to the 12 constellations. And so the Midrash Yalkut Shimoni, and it's in other places, says, if you remember the Israelite camp in the wilderness after the Exodus, it had like 4 major camps, right? 3 tribes on each side, and then the Levim in the center. And so the Midrash says, Shevet Yehuda b'Mizrach. So Yehuda was the main tribe on the east, and Issachar and Zvulun were with Yehuda in that camp, those 3, and Kenegdam b'Marom, so corresponding to these 3, to Yehuda, Issachar, and Zvulun, are the signs of Taleh, Shor, and Teumim. So the Aries, Taurus, and Gemini correspond to Yehuda, Issachar, and Zvulun. And then Degel Reuven, so Reuben was in the south, Badarom, and Shimon and Gad were in that camp, and corresponding to them are the signs of Sartan, Arieh, and Betula, so Cancer, Leo, and Virgo. And then Ephraim was in the west with Menashe and Binyamin, and corresponding to them is Moznaim, Akarav, and Kashat, so which is Libra and Scorpio and Sagittarius. And then Dan Betzafon and Asher and Naphtali Imo. So Dan, Asher, and Naphtali were in the north, and corresponding to them was the Gdi, Deli, and Dagim. So Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. And then they correspond to the 12 major qualities of life. And so we're gonna go through them. And Sefer Yetzirah tells us that where do these mazalot really come from? What is their spiritual origin? They actually come from the names of God, or from the name of God, right? Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. So there's God's name, Yud He Vav He, can be rearranged 12 ways. There are 12 ways to rearrange it. So like you have Yud Hey Vav Hey, you have Yud Hey Hey Vav, Yud Vav Hey Hey, and so on. There are 12 possible permutations of God's name, and that's the spiritual source for these 12 major mazalot. And they also correspond to the 12 boundaries of our physical reality, right? Because we live in a three-dimensional universe. We have three axes, X, Y, and Z. And you can imagine our universe as being essentially in a cube, right? We have three dimensions, and in a cube, there are 12 edges, okay? So these 12 edges also correspond to the 12 mazalot, to the 12 permutations of God's name. They are the boundaries of our reality. So that's also from Sefer Yetzirah. And they actually also correspond, the Magen David, one of the secrets of the Magen David is that it also has 12 edges. If you count the number of edges around the Star of David, there are 12 edges, which corresponds to the 12 boundaries of the physical universe and to the 12 permutations of God's name, and to the 12 constellations, and to the 12 tribes of Israel, and another set of 12, which we're going to get to. So I'm going to briefly go through each of the 12 signs and just show you a little bit of how it connects to the Torah and to the Jewish calendar. So to see how we can use astrology to help us better understand Torah and the Jewish calendar. So the first one, of course, is Aries, which corresponds to the month of Nisan and to the tribe of Yehudah. And that corresponds to the quality of speech. And it's a fire sign. Each of the 12 signs corresponds to one of the four elements of fire, earth, water, air. So Nisan is a fire sign, and they also correspond to one of the 12 elemental letters. If you remember, in our first class about the fundamentals of Kabbalah, we talked about the letters of the alphabet, and there are 3 mother letters and 7 doubled letters and 12 elemental, yesodot, elemental letters. So each of the 12 months and signs and tribes also corresponds to one of the elemental letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So this one corresponds to Hey, and this is the permutation of God's name, which is Yud Hey Vav Hey, and it's a fire sign. This is the astrology, kind of international symbol for Aries. And if you look up in the night sky, there are more stars in Aries. This is like a stylized picture of it. With the naked eye, it'll look actually something like this. Doesn't look like much of a ram or sheep, but it's supposed to. If you have really good eyes and you're in a place of less light pollution, perhaps you can make out. It's a little bit arbitrary, but in any case, it's a sheep or a ram. And if you connect, if you think about Nisan, the main event of Nisan is, of course, Pesach. Right? It's all about Passover. And when you think about Pesach, you should already be able to connect the dots. What does Pesach, Nisan have to do with a sheep or a ram? Because, of course, the whole main mitzvah of Pesach was the Paschal lamb, right? The sacrifice. The Pesach offering was a sacrifice of a sheep or ram. Sheep and ram is the same thing. Ram is just a male sheep with horns. So to sacrifice the Paschal lamb. And this is really important because in ancient Egypt, Aries was the sign of their main god. The main god of Egypt was Ra, or Amun-Ra at one point. And Ra, the symbol of Ra, like in this little picture, was a ram. Okay? This is a ram-headed god. Ra also represented the sun. And that's why God specifically commanded, and you can see the commentaries on the Torah say this, Rashi and others, that why did God specifically command the Jewish people to take a sheep or ram to be slaughtered in Nisan? Because in Nisan, the Egyptians worshipped Ra. That was the time of their chief god, who was symbolized by a sheep or a ram. And so to make it a point, remember the whole point of the Exodus was to prove to both Israel and the Egyptians that the idolatry is null and meaningless, that there are no idols, these are false gods. So there's only one true God without any image, without any form, right? Super all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient God without any image. So to drive that message home, God commanded Israel and said, specifically in this time when the Egyptians worship Ra, worship this ram-headed God, this sheep, now is the time to take a sheep and sacrifice it before their eyes, just to show how meaningless idolatry is and how powerless Ra is. And Ra is actually, if you look carefully in the Torah, when the Israelites want to leave and Moshe is talking to Pharaoh, Pharaoh actually tells Moshe that Ra will get you in the wilderness. It actually says Ra, the word, Resh Ain, Ra. So when you read it like Pshat, if you're just reading quickly in Hebrew, the way you would read it is that something Ra, that something evil will befall you in the wilderness. But that's not what Pharaoh's saying, right? Pharaoh didn't speak Hebrew. Pharaoh's saying that Ra, my God, Ra will get you, right? Will get you in the wilderness. And again, if you look at the commentary, you'll see there that what he meant when he said Ra is not really Ra, it's Ra, right? That Ra will get you. He hoped that his God would step in and harm the Israelites, but of course that didn't happen. So that's Ra. That's the idea of Pesach, the connection here of Aries and sacrificing Aries in the time of Aries in Egypt. That was that. And then the next month is Iyar. Iyar is the month of Sfirat HaOmer. So that's the main thing here that we're talking about. It's about the time of personal development, growth, and Iyar corresponds fittingly to the quality of thought and to Issachar. If you remember Issachar, in the terms of the tribes, the sons of Yaakov, Issachar was the scholar, and everybody knows Issachar was the one that was learning Torah all day. Issachar and Zvulun had a partnership that Zvulun was working, and he was the businessman making the money and funding Issachar. Issachar were the scholars and the astronomers, actually, the scholars, the scribes, the teachers, the Torah learners. That was Issachar. So Issachar corresponds to thought, to vehegita bo yomam velayla, right? As it says in the Tanakh, that you should meditate upon the Torah day and night. That's Issachar. Learning, meditating upon the Torah, thought, it's the power of thought, that's Issachar. And that's what the Sfirat HaOmer period is all about, right? It's a period of contemplation and meditation, and the sign is a bull, Taurus. It's a time to be like a bull, to work hard, and the bull is a symbol of work, of labor. So it's a time to work hard. It's a little bit of like stubbornness, of keep going, of persistence. That's the time of Sfirat HaOmer, of working on yourself, of hard work and thought and contemplation. That's the idea, and increasing Torah and mitzvot. That's the and then it culminates in Sivan, which is when we receive the Torah, right? Sivan is Shavuot. Shavuot is when we receive the Torah. And that corresponds to Zvulun, the brother of Issachar, I mean, the second half of that partnership. And it says here the quality is action, but if you look down, this chart I took from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan's Sefer Yetzir book, which is a wonderful book that everybody should have and read. And he has action twice here for some reason. So it should actually say more like progress or development. The word in Hebrew is haloch. Okay, so one is ma'aseh, which is action, but here it should actually be sometimes translated as progress or development. It's about development, working, personal development, progress, and because that's ultimately what the Torah was given for. Right? Why was the Torah given? Like the Midrash famously says, that the Torah was given, the mitzvot were given to us to refine us, to help us develop ourselves, to become better people. That's what the mitzvot are for. And so that's why the quality of Sivan is development, right? Personal development, the mitzvahs, we got the Torah. And Gemini is a set of twins. So it's interesting that the Torah, when we received the 10 Commandments on Shavuot, that it was given on a set of 2 tablets, on twin tablets. If you ever wondered why were there have to be 2 tablets? Why couldn't just everything be written on 1 tablet? Put it all on 1 piece of stone, make it simpler. But it was given on 2 twin tablets where the laws on each one corresponded to one another. So a lot of the commentaries talk about this, how they were like twins, and the mitzvot written on one corresponded to the mitzvot written on the other, and they're like a set of twins, like Gemini twins. And the Sefer Ayovlim, the book of Jubilees, very fascinating statement there. So the book of Jubilees, very ancient book, not a little bit controversial, never really fully accepted in the rabbinic tradition so much, but was definitely a source for Midrash and Kabbalah. And the book of Jubilees really teaches us a lot of interesting things. One of the most ancient Hebrew books that we have. And it says something, it says this, it says, when Yaakov was with Leah, his wife, Leah gave birth to 2 kids, Ben, Bebat. So she actually had 2 children, a son and a daughter. V'tikra et shmo Zvulun, the boy was called Zvulun, but Shem Abat Dina, and the girl was called Dina. Okay, so according to in rabbinic tradition, really the accepted tradition is that Zvulun and Dina were two different pregnancies, but according to the book of Jubilees, they were actually twins. Yeah, they were a brother and sister fraternal twins from one pregnancy. So those are our Gemini twins. Okay? The ancient Hebrew understanding of the Gemini twins. Every culture and mythology has a different name for the twin. You know, the Greeks are Castor and Pollux, like here, but the ancient Hebrew names for Gemini twins were Zvulun and Dina. So that's Gemini. Okay, then we get to Tammuz, the month that we're in now. And that corresponds to sight and the tribe of Reuven. Reuven literally means sight, to see, right? Reuven. That's why Leah called him Reuven, because she said, look, see, I have a boy. So Reuven literally means sight. And it's the month of Tammuz, which is Cancer. And Cancer, it's considered, like the name suggests, it's a little ominous, you know, Cancer, there's illness. Cancer doesn't sound so good. Cancer is associated with like the painful pinch of the crab, the claws of the crab. Something, there seems to be something negative, something dangerous about Cancer. And in many cultures, this was considered some kind of dangerous time, a time of death. Right? Tammuz is actually mentioned in the Tanakh as one of the false idols in Babylon. And that there was a whole myth around Tammuz about the death and resurrection of Tammuz. Of course, Tammuz right now, it has nothing to do with the god Tammuz. It's the name of the month Tammuz. But still, there is this idea of danger and death. And so when you connect that to the period of the 3 weeks, where does this idea come from? That this is an unlucky time, right? A time of negative mazal, because Tammuz has that negative aspect to it. The time of danger, the time of the crab, okay? Time of death. That's where it originates from. And the Rambam would say, don't believe in it, right? Because you have God on your side, so don't worry about it. So that's Tammuz. And there's more to discuss here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to speed things up because we're running out of time. There is a connection there that maybe we'll leave for another time about the illness Cancer and the constellation Cancer, the astrological connection there. And then we have Av, which is Leo, which is Shimon, which has to do with hearing. Again, Shimon means, again, the root of Shimon is Shema, it's hearing, and it's a fire sign. And the letter is Tet, which is fitting because the main day of Av is Tisha B'Av, right? That's what defines the month, is Tisha B'Av. And Leo is the lion. And you can connect the pieces together because the lion, Ariel, the god's lion, was a name for Jerusalem. So when Ishayahu prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, right? He says, "Hoy Ariel, Ariel," like woe to Ariel, Jerusalem, Kiryat Chana, David. This is the to the city of David. Woe to the city of David, the place where we would go, Safu Shanal Shana Chagim, for the holidays, but it's going to be destroyed. So that God is going to bring troubles to Ariel, to Jerusalem. That God will put besiege it. He will bring a siege upon it. And that's ultimately what happened, right? With the Babylonians that came and besieged Jerusalem and destroyed it. So Jerusalem is referred to specifically as Ariel, as the lion of God. And it was destroyed on Tisha B'Av, right? So Tisha B'Av, that's the connection to the lion. And we're going to see again, that's going to come up again later, about the connection between the lion and Jerusalem and the temple. And in this is Lion's Gate in Jerusalem. So the Midrash says like that, when did really spiritually the destruction of the temple originate? And it says that Bayom shenitchaten Shlomo lebat Paro, if you remember, King Solomon started marrying a lot of different wives to try to bring peace. And he broke the law that you're not supposed to have so many wives. So he took too many wives. And that ended up being his downfall. And the very day that he married Bat Paro, the Egyptian princess, Yarad Gavriel, that the angel Gabriel came and Na'atz Kaneh Bayam, and he put a reed in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, Ve'ala Sham, and then from there came out Krach Gadol Shel Roma. That's where Rome would eventually be founded, on that spot, on the plot that was established by Gabriel on the Mediterranean, by the Mediterranean. On the very day that King Solomon got married, King Solomon built the temple, but through his, unfortunately, his lack of foresight, he married too many women, and they ended up bringing about his downfall, and that led to the splitting of the kingdom of Israel and a whole bunch of sins that led to the destruction of the temple. So even though King Solomon built the temple, his actions also kind of spiritually set the foundations for the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And later on, it adds that Beyom she'emid Yerovam shnei galim, that later, when after King Solomon, the kingdom split in half, and the northern king of the northern kingdom, Yerovam, he set up a couple of calves as like a new temple. At that time, Amad Romus veRomulus, that Remus and Romulus, the famed founders, the mythological founders of Rome, arose, okay, and Banu Sham, and they started building their village over there. So the events that were happening in Rome in the West are connected spiritually to what was happening in Israel in the East. There is a connection there to Hercules, but I'm going to leave that aside for now. Then we have Virgo. Okay, Virgo is, oh, and I should say with hearing, of course, like the reason for the temple being destroyed is a lack of heeding God, right? The whole idea of being Shema Yisrael, of hearing God. We say this all the time, that we should listen to God's commands, right? Shamanu ve'asinu, or Na'aseh v'nishma. Once in the Torah, it's a Shamanu ve'asinu. In other places, Na'aseh v'nishma, that we should listen to God and do his commands. And because we didn't listen, or then the Jewish people didn't listen, it led to the destruction of the temple. And then we get to Virgo, which is Elul, which is the time of repentance, purification, right? The days of tshuva. The whole month is a time to do tshuva and slichot, and the time that everybody is repenting and purifying. And so, of course, the astrological sign has to do with Virgo, which is about purity, right? Virginity, purity, returning to a virgin state. And we know it's very famous that Elul actually is set to stand for Anila Dodiva Dodili, from Shira Shirim, right? The relationship between us and God, between the Jewish people and God, right? That like loving relationship between the two, and we're kind of coming back to God, coming back to a pure kind of virgin state. That's the time of Elul, getting ready for the high holidays. And then the high holidays are Tishrei, is Libra, right? So of course that's perfect, because Libra is the scales of justice. And that's what Tishrei is about, right? Rosh Hashanah and then Yom Kippur, it's all about judgment. It's all about weighing our deeds on the kind of scales. God is judging us, weighing us to see our deeds and merits and so on. So that's Tishrei, that's Libra. And the connection is to sexual intimacy there, because that's one of the main things that people need to work on and repent for. And on Yom Kippur, that's actually what we read. One of the Torah readings of Yom Kippur, specifically to read about the sexual prohibitions, and that's one of the main things that people need to work on. There are three cardinal sins, right? The three main sins. There's murder and idolatry and adultery and sexual sin, gilui arayot, which is all kinds of sexual sins, adultery, incest, whatever, sodomy, all kinds of things. So under the category of sexual sin. And murder is not something that the average person would ever think to do. Like the vast majority of people will never never want to murder anybody, or will never murder, God forbid, and have no thought to murder anybody. So murder is like extremely rare in the mind of the average person. It's just not going to happen. And then you have idolatry and sexual sins. Those are the big ones. Now, idolatry today is not something that people have a desire for. And there's a reason for that. The Talmud tells us how that happened. Why is idolatry no longer such a big thing that people are drawn to? It says Tashma. So we read in Nehemiah, remember Ezra and Nehemiah were the two main leaders that brought the Jewish people back to Israel after the Babylonian exile to reestablish the Jewish life in Israel, rebuild the temple, the second temple. And it says there, "Veizaku bekol gadol el Hashem," that they cried out in a high voice to God. And what did they cry out? So the Gemara says, what did they say? And they said that, I'm just going to paraphrase here, that because of idolatry, the temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were exiled. So what did they say? What did they do? Yatvu taltayoma, they sat for 3 days, betanita, and fasted and prayed, okay, for God to remove the desire for idolatry. It said idolatry is so horrible that because of idolatry, the temple was destroyed and we were exiled. So the sages got together and prayed and fasted for 3 days and said, God, just take that desire away from the Jewish people. Remove the desire. This is the Yetzer Hara for idolatry. And they were answered from heaven. So Pitka Milkia, like a note came as if from heaven, and Ktiv Ba'emet, it said truth on it, that, okay, like I'm going to grant it to you. And it says, Nafak Kiguria de Dinura, then Guria Dinura, like a lion of fire came out of Mibeit Koche Kodashim, from the temple. And that actually connects back to our fire, Leo, fire sign lion. We said how that connects to the temple, right? Represents Ariel, the temple. So they saw like a vision of a fiery lion come out of the temple. And I'm just shortening it. It's a long story. Ultimately, the desire for idolatry was destroyed. Now, the sages then realized, okay, it's great that there's no longer any desire for idolatry. And since then, over the past 2,000 plus years, there's never really been idolatry in Israel. We no longer have a desire for this. So murder is for most people, is never something that's going to enter their mind. Idolatry as well is not something that's going to affect people. So what are we left with? The remaining cardinal sin is gilui arayot, sexual things. So what did the sages say? Amre ohil ve'et ratzonhu. It's a very auspicious time. God answered us with idolatry. Let's also ask him to remove the desire for all kinds of sexual sins. So they did that. And God, again, they did the same thing. And again, they were answered. And then 3 days later, they saw that there are no eggs left, right? They couldn't find a single egg, because now that there was no desire for any sexual intimacy, right? Even chickens weren't, getting together, and there weren't even eggs left. There was no desire even for reproduction. So they realized that this is gonna, like, the world cannot continue. There has to be like the Yetzer Hara, in the sense that sexual desire has to remain. We can't remove it, because otherwise nothing will reproduce and the world will be destroyed. And so we're left with basically the major source of sin, unfortunately, is sexually related. And so that's why that's one of the main focuses of repentance. And so that all connects again to Virgo and Libra. Okay, we'll pause here and then we'll continue hopefully in a couple of weeks.